Every sheet of sandpaper has a number on the back, and that number is the single most important piece of information on the entire product. It tells you the size of the abrasive particles glued to the backing. Lower number means bigger particles and a more aggressive cut. Higher number means smaller particles and a smoother finish. A 60 grit particle is roughly the size of a grain of table salt. A 220 grit particle is closer to the size of flour. Double the grit number and you roughly cut the particle size in half. That number actually comes from 1-inch mesh screens used to sort the particles by size. If a screen has 40 holes, it will allow larger particles to pass through, while a screen with 400 holes will allow finer particles. Finer particles pack tighter, so the number climbs. You'll also see an actual letter on some packaging. If the number is prefixed with a P, that's the European FEPA standard. A plain number with no letter is the American CAMI standard. Same idea, slightly different sizing between the two systems, but low number always means coarse and high number always means fine on both. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes: skipping grits. Going from 80 straight to 220 feels efficient, but it isn't. The 80 grit leaves deep scratches, and 220 grit is too fine to remove them in any reasonable amount of time. You end up sanding for twice as long as if you had just stepped through 120 and 150 first. The rule is simple: never skip more than one step in the progression. 80, 120, 150, 180, 220. Each step removes the scratch pattern left by the step before it. And once you know the number, you know the job. 40 to 60 is for stripping paint and flattening warped lumber. 80 is the transition grit before you move to smoothing. 100 to 150 removes mill marks from planers and joiners and does the bulk of the actual smoothing work on most projects. 180 to 220 is where bare wood gets prepped for finish. And anything past 320 isn't touching bare wood at all anymore. That's between coat sanding, knocking down dust nibs and raised grain without cutting into the finish itself. If you're sanding that fine and you see bare wood showing up, you're pressing too hard. The grit number tells you how coarse the particle is. It says nothing about what that particle is actually made of, and that turns out to matter just as much. Aluminum oxide. This is the sandpaper you already own, whether you know the name or not. Aluminum oxide is the default abrasive for wood, drywall, and general repair work, and it earns that spot for one specific reason: it's self-sharpening. As the particles wear down under pressure, they don't round off and go dull, they fracture, and fracturing exposes a brand new sharp edge underneath. A worn out piece of aluminum oxide paper is still cutting almost as well, right up until the particles are physically too small to do anything. It's tough, it's cheap, and it works on hardwood and softwood alike, and it's available in basically every grit from 36 all the way to 600. If you only ever buy one type of abrasive, this is the one. Silicon carbide. Silicon carbide is harder and sharper than aluminum oxide, and that extra hardness lets it cut materials aluminum oxide struggles with: glass, stone, metal, and cured finishes. This is the abrasive behind wet sanding. Pair it with water or mineral spirits and it stays sharp longer, clogs less, and produces a noticeably smoother result than sanding dry. That's why it's the standard choice for rubbing out lacquer and polyurethane between coats, and for automotive bodywork and clear coat polishing. It's also made in extremely fine grits, well past 1000, going into territory aluminum oxide doesn't even bother reaching. Garnet. Garnet is a natural mineral, and it does the opposite of aluminum oxide. Instead of fracturing to stay sharp, it dulls as you use it. On paper that sounds like a downside, and for raw cutting speed it is. But that dulling edge burnishes the wood surface instead of tearing it, and a burnished surface takes stain more evenly than one left by a sharper, more aggressive abrasive. Furniture restorers reach for garnet specifically for the last pass, before staining open grain woods like oak and walnut, where an uneven scratch pattern would show up as blotching under the stain. Ceramic and zirconia. These are the synthetic heavyweights. Ceramic abrasive is the hardest commonly available option on the market, and it holds its cutting edge for far longer than aluminum oxide under heavy pressure and heat. You'll find it in belt sander belts, angle grinder flap discs, and industrial sanding rolls, anywhere the abrasive is under serious load. It's genuinely overkill for hand sanding a picture frame, but it's the right call for power tools working hardwood, metal, or composites, materials that would chew through a softer abrasive in minutes. Knife makers are a good example. A lot of them start out buying cheap aluminum oxide belts because the price is right, but the woods used in knife handles, like cocobolo, African blackwood, desert ironwood, are either naturally rock hard or stabilized to be even harder. Ceramic belts last dramatically longer on that material, and once you do the math on how many aluminum oxide belts you're burning through, the cheaper option isn't actually cheaper. Now, knowing what the particle is made of only gets you halfway there. The other variable is how densely those particles are packed onto the backing, and that changes the entire personality of the abrasive. Picture two sheets of the same aluminum oxide paper, same grit, same everything, except one has abrasive covering the full surface and the other has visible gaps between the particles. That's the difference between closed coat and open coat. Closed coat abrasive has 90 to 95% of its surface covered in grit. More grit per square inch means a more aggressive cut and a more uniform finish, which is why it's the standard for hard, dense material, hardwood, metal, and finish work like lacquer, where you want an even scratch pattern. The trade-off shows up on soft material, sand pine or aluminum with a closed coat abrasive, and the little bit of space between particles fills up with debris almost immediately. Once that debris, called swarf, packs in completely, the abrasive stops cutting and starts generating heat instead, and enough heat will burn both the belt and the workpiece. Open coat abrasive only covers 50 to 70% of the surface, and that gap is the entire point. More space between particles means more room for sawdust and debris to fall away instead of packing in, and it lets air flow through to cool the abrasive down. That's why open coat is a standard for soft, gummy material. Cedar, pine, fir, and soft metals like aluminum and brass. There's also a middle ground called semi-open, roughly 30% less coverage than closed coat, which cuts a bit more aggressively than full open coat while still resisting clogging, better than closed coat does. If you're a woodworker or doing general house projects, open coat aluminum oxide covers almost everything you'll run into. Backing weight matters just as much as the grit in the coating, because the backing decides whether the paper survives the job at all. Paper backing. Paper backing is graded by weight, lettered A through F, and the letter tells you how the sheet will handle. A weight is thin and flexible, built for hand sanding curves and detailed profiles, where the paper needs to bend around a shape. C weight is the one you'll use most often by hand. Flexible enough to wrap a sanding block, but stiff enough to lay flat without buckling on you mid-stroke. D and E weight are thick and stiff, and those are reserved for belt sanders and drum sanders, machines that put real tension on the paper at speed. Put A weight paper on a belt sander and it will shred before you finish a single pass. Cloth backing. Cloth backing exists because paper simply can't survive certain jobs. Sanding belts, flap discs, and shop rolls all use cloth backing because the stress of a power tool running at speed would tear paper apart in seconds. It costs more per sheet, but it lasts proportionally longer, which makes it the more economical option once you're running high volume work. J-weight cloth stays flexible for contour work, while X-weight cloth is stiff, built for flat sanding and belt applications where you need the backing to hold its shape. PSA and hook and loop. This is about how the disc actually attaches to your sander, and it's a trade-off between cost and speed. PSA, pressure sensitive adhesive, is a straightforward peel and stick disc. It's cheap, but once it's stuck down, swapping grits mid-job is a slow, sticky process. Hook and loop works like Velcro, and it costs more per disc, but changing grits takes about 2 seconds. On a random orbit sander where you're realistically moving through 3 or 4 grits in a single session, that time savings adds up fast, and for anyone doing production work, hook and loop pays for itself well within one project. Sanding sponges. Flat paper can't wrap around a curve, and that's exactly the gap sanding sponges fill. Abrasive is bonded directly to a flexible foam core, and that foam compresses to follow the shape of whatever you're working. So contact stays even across molding profiles, turn parts, and rounded edges where a flat sheet would only touch the high points. They're also genuinely useful on drywall compound, because that same flexibility follows the slight waves and imperfections in a wall surface that a rigid block would miss entirely. There's one more variable that changes everything about how any of these abrasives behave, and it has nothing to do with the abrasive itself. It's whether you use it wet or dry. Wet sanding means running the abrasive with water or mineral spirits as a lubricant, and it's almost always done with silicon carbide paper specifically because that abrasive is built to handle it. The lubricant does two things. It keeps the paper from clogging, and it carries heat away that would otherwise build up on the surface. That's why it's the standard method for rubbing out lacquer, polyurethane, and automotive clear coat, where the goal is a glass smooth final surface with no swirl marks. What wet sanding is not for is bare wood. Water soaks into the fibers, raises the grain, and can cause swelling and warping, so bare wood stays strictly a dry sanding job until a sealed finish is on it.